He shoved the black man onto the courthouse steps, no warning, no questions. Just a badge, a frown, and cold handcuffs. The man didn't resist, didn't speak, just stared, like he'd seen this coming. What that young cop didn't know, the man he just arrested decides the fate of the nation. If that made you pause, don't scroll, because what happens next rewrites what you thought justice looked like. Tap, like if you believe dignity doesn't need volume, and come with me. This story begins with silence but ends with power. The morning air was thick, not with rain, but with that heavy silence cities get when something's about to shift. A line of people waited quietly outside the Supreme Court. Some murmured into their phones, others scrolled, and then they noticed him. A tall black man, older sharp-boned coat buttoned to the neck, stood near the top step. He didn't pace, didn't check the time. He just stood there, still, like the building behind him belonged to him in some quiet ancient way. People glanced unsure. Was he staff a protester? A visitor? That's when the young white cop saw him, eyes narrow, shoulders squared. He didn't ask where the man was going, didn't ask if he needed help. He just walked up, hand on his belt. ID now. The man turned slowly, voice steady as if correcting a student. It's in the car, just stepped out to think. No raised tone, no sudden move. But that didn't matter. Without hesitation, the officer grabbed him, spun him around, and pushed him down on the steps. Cuffs clicked. Someone gasped. A phone clicked on. But the crowd remained silent. The man didn't flinch, didn't plead, didn't even ask why. He just looked forward at nothing. Or maybe at everything. The booking room was quiet, not peaceful quiet, but the kind that hums under bad lighting and worse intentions. They didn't ask him anything. Just led him to a metal bench, slapped down a clipboard, and mumbled to no one in particular. No ID, call him John Doe. Behind a low desk, a clerk, young, uninterested, typed like every keystroke was a burden. He didn't look up once. Didn't ask the man's age, didn't ask if he understood the charges. He just filled in blanks with assumptions. Race black, age 60-something, maybe. Occupation unknown. When they reached for the fingerprint scanner, it blinked red. System error. Again, forget it. Log it manually. Across the room, two younger officers leaned into each other. One whispered, "He doesn't act like a regular guy. You see his eyes." But no one said anything to him, and he still said nothing back. Yet beneath the silence, something else was happening. He took in the nameplate on the desk, M. Harrisoff Center, one screw missing. Noted the badge number on the sergeant's chest slightly tilted from the weight of the radio mic. Up in the corner, the only surveillance camera was half blocked by a puffy winter coat carelessly tossed over the mount. Not an accident, he registered that too. Movements in and out of the room, he watched them. Who avoided eye contact? Who gave it too much? Every gesture, every glance, every careless corner. He absorbed it all, not to defend himself, but to understand the room. To understand them. He wasn't lost, he wasn't confused, and he wasn't afraid. No, he was studying, like a man who had seen rooms like this before, too many times, and knew this one would matter. The local courthouse sat like it always did, tired, underfunded, pretending to carry the weight of justice, while its ceiling fans buzzed like they were running out of patience. They brought him in just after lunch. The chains around his wrists clinked softly with each step, a sound that somehow felt louder than it should have been. People in the hallway turned their heads, not out of concern, out of habit. He walked slowly, not because he was old, but like someone who had no interest in proving he could move fast. The bailiff barely looked at him. The public defender glanced once and went back to her phone. To them, he was another case file in handcuffs, another man without a name. Inside the courtroom, the chatter settled. He sat alone at the defense table, silent hands folded gently, almost too gently for someone in cuffs. From the back row, a woman in her 60s leaned over to the man beside her. She squinted, then whispered, "He looks like Langston Pierce. You know, from the news." The man beside her shrugged, didn't even bother to look. But the woman kept watching. There was something about the way he held himself. Not proud, not stubborn, just still, as if the chaos around him didn't reach him. His wrist showed faint bruises where the cuffs had bitten in. He rotated one slowly, massaging the bone beneath, not like it hurt, but like he was reminding himself he was still here. The judge hadn't entered yet, but the courtroom had already made up its mind. Some looked at him like he was a nuisance. Others like he didn't belong there. A few just ignored him altogether. But in the corner near the clerk's desk, a younger court officer paused. He held a stack of papers but wasn't reading them. He was watching the man. His brows drew together slowly like a memory trying to surface. And the man, still not speaking, tilted his head slightly. Not enough to be noticed by most. Just enough to let the young officer know, "I see you seeing me." It wasn't threatening. It wasn't a challenge. It was acknowledgement. And in that moment, something shifted, not in the room, but in the people watching. They couldn't quite name it, but something about the silence began to feel different. Like it wasn't just the silence of a man with no voice, but the silence of a man waiting for the world to realize what it had just done. The courtroom door creaked open, and in came the Judge White, late 50s robes, wrinkled from sitting too long or caring too little. Judge Grayson didn't look up right away. He adjusted his glasses, cleared his throat like the air itself owed him silence, and opened the file without urgency. Then flatly he read, "Case number 681, defendant charged with disturbing the peace, public nuisance." He paused like he expected no one to care. And no one did. The courtroom was half empty. The people who were there weren't watching for justice. They were just watching. At the prosecution table, a clean-cut woman in a dark blazer stood up. Her voice didn't carry warmth, only certainty. "Your Honor, this man refused to cooperate or identify himself. There's no reason to drag this out. I suggest a short sentence, time served, maybe 30 days. She didn't even glance at the man she was trying to punish. He wasn't a person to her, just a line on her schedule. On the defense side, a court-appointed attorney finally turned to acknowledge the man beside her. She looked at him like he was already lost. "Sir, do you even understand the charges? No kindness, no patience, just the obligation of a question she didn't want answered." He didn't reply. He didn't move, didn't even shift in his seat. From the back of the room near the gallery, one of the arresting officers leaned against the wall, arms crossed, smirking. He whispered, not too quietly, "Shouldn't take more than 5 minutes." The judge heard it, didn't say a word. He turned to the defendant, pen already in hand, ready to jot down whatever was needed to close the file. "Mr. Doe," he said, almost annoyed, "do you have anything to say for yourself before I move on?" And for the first time, the man looked up. He didn't speak, just raised his eyes, calm, unwavering, and stared directly at Judge Grayson. No words, no plea, just that stare. The kind of stare that made time forget to move. The kind that didn't challenge with barrier, but revealed the imbalance in the room, revealed who had power and who had none. Even the clerk paused her typing. The young court officer in the corner sat up straighter, and the judge, for a flicker of a moment, cleared his throat again. Not because he needed to, but because he didn't know what else to do. The silence wasn't empty now, it was full, heavy. It filled every corner of that room with the weight of a question no one dared ask. "Who is this man?" There was a pause, a long one, after the silence in the room swallowed the judge's question. The man said nothing, still, composed, watching. Judge Grayson shifted slightly in his seat. Maybe it was the stare. Maybe it was the stillness. Or maybe it was something he couldn't name. He exhaled sharply through his nose, flipped a page, and spoke like the case bored him now. 30 days. County jail, contempt of court. The gavel didn't even come down hard, just a tap, almost lazy, like the punishment meant nothing because the man meant nothing. But then something happened. A change so small if you blinked you'd miss it. The man's lips curved, not fully, not wide, just enough. A smile. Not mockery, not sarcasm, more like someone who'd been waiting for this exact moment and finally saw the system expose itself. The kind of smile that doesn't warm a room, it chills it. The smirk on the arresting officer's face faded. He straightened up, arms uncrossing. Something in him, that part trained to sense when control shifts began to stir. He couldn't name it, but he didn't like it. At the clerk's station, a young woman stared at her screen, blinking more than usual. She wasn't typing anymore. She was rechecking something. She leaned forward, pulled up the intake file, then the arrest log, and finally the emergency database, fingers trembling just slightly. The image on the screen, it was the same man, same coat, same face. But the name, her eyes widened. She whispered not to anyone in particular, more like trying to convince herself she hadn't read it wrong. Langston Pierce. No, can't be. She glanced up slowly, eyes locked on the man sitting silently at the table. He didn't move, but she knew. The name wasn't just familiar, it was monumental. And now the weight of that name hung in the air like a storm cloud no one saw coming, except him. He remained still, hands relaxed cuffs, still digging lightly into his skin. But the power in the room had shifted imperceptibly but undeniably. Grayson didn't notice. Not yet. He was already on to the next case file trying to keep the docket moving. But others did. The young court officer from earlier, the one who couldn't stop watching, now leaned in elbows on knees, his whole body tense. The defense attorney, still flipping papers, slowed her movements without realizing it. Even the prosecutor hesitated, sensing something off, though she wouldn't dare say so out loud. And the man, he just sat there, that same quiet smile resting on his face. Not triumphant, not arrogant, just assured, like he'd seen it all before and knew exactly what came next. The courtroom hadn't exploded. No one yelled, no gasps or camera flashes, not yet. But it felt like everyone had taken one collective breath and forgot to let it out. In a quiet back office just beyond the courtroom, a phone rang. It wasn't the desk phone, not the main line. This one was direct, the kind only a few people ever called. The clerk looked at it once, frowned, then picked up. Clerk's office, downtown district court. The voice on the other end was calm, precise, not rushed, but with a tone that left no room for small talk. You're holding someone you absolutely shouldn't. Langston H. Pierce, Supreme Court Justice. The clerk blinked, sat up straighter. He glanced at the screen again as if hoping he'd misheard the name. I'm sorry, could you repeat? There's no time to repeat. You need to alert the presiding judge immediately. That man cannot be held. Not for one more minute. The call ended, just like that. No room for questions, no room for doubt. He looked down at the file in front of him, the one marked John Doe. Intake photo, age estimate, no ID. But the face, it was him. He stood up quickly, nearly knocking over his chair, and moved toward the courtroom. But just outside the door, he hesitated. Inside, the hearing was still in motion. Judge Grayson was speaking. The prosecutor was flipping through notes. The man at the center of it all sat perfectly still, that same half-smile unmoved. The clerk leaned in toward a bailiff by the door. I need to get a message to the judge, now. The bailiff frowned. Is it urgent? Yes, it's federal, about the defendant. That word federal got his attention. They passed a note forward. It moved from hand to hand through the gallery over to the side desk, finally landing at the foot of the bench. Judge Grayson took it, without looking, opened it, and scanned the contents. Then with a low chuckle, he set it aside. We'll sort that out after the hearing, he said, barely hiding the smirk. Probably just some bureaucratic overreaction. He didn't glance at the man in cuffs, didn't ask a single question, just moved to the next line on his docket like nothing had happened. In the gallery, someone shifted uncomfortably. The court reporter glanced up uncertain. Even the prosecutor paused, then quickly looked back down. But the judge unaffected. In the back of the courtroom, a young officer who'd been watching closely this whole time leaned toward his supervisor. Sir, I think there's been a mistake. That man. But before he could finish, the supervisor cut him off with a look. Cold, sharp. Don't interfere, he muttered under his breath. This one's ours. The younger officer leaned back, lips pressed tight. His hands fidgeted in his lap. He didn't look away, but he didn't speak again either. Something had shifted in the air. Not a full wind, just a tension like the room itself knew a line had been crossed but didn't know how to say it out loud. And in the middle of it all, still sitting there quietly, was the man himself. Unbothered, unshaken, just waiting. Waiting as people around him began to realize what they'd done. Judge Grayson raised his pen, slow, deliberate. He wasn't in a rush, not because the moment required care, but because in his mind this was routine. Another name, another file, another man forgotten by the system. The ink touched the paper just barely when, bang, the double doors of the courtroom slammed open with a force that echoed off the marble walls. Gasps shot through the room, papers fluttered, every head turned. 3 people entered. Dark suits, steady steps, no hesitation. They didn't ask permission. They didn't flash badges right away. They didn't need to. The one in front, tall, crisp voice, no emotion, stepped forward, pulled a document from inside his jacket and announced, "All rise." There was a beat 1 second where no one moved. Just silence. Frozen. Then the man's voice cut through again, sharper this time. Presenting Supreme Court Justice Langston H. Pierce. Like a switch had been flipped, the entire room stood too fast, too suddenly. Chairs scraped, shoes shuffled, hearts skipped. The judge's pen dropped from his hand and rolled off the bench, landing on the floor with a hollow clack. The prosecutor dropped her file. The public defender turned pale. The bailiff's mouth opened slightly, then shut. The court clerk, young woman who had searched the database earlier, brought a hand to her mouth, covering a soundless "oh my God." At the back of the gallery, the elderly woman who'd whispered his name an hour ago, her eyes welled up. She didn't speak, just let one tear fall down her cheek. And in the middle of it all, still seated, was him. Langston H. Pierce, calm, composed. He didn't move right away, didn't look at the judge, didn't look at the officers now lining the wall in silence. He just stood, slowly, like a man who'd been waiting not for permission but for the truth to arrive. As he rose, the cuffs still hung at his wrists, but no one dared step forward to remove them. Not yet. He looked around once, not to accuse, not to gloat, but to let the weight of the moment land exactly where it needed to. Then finally his eyes found Judge Grayson. The judge tried to speak, opened his mouth, but the words didn't come. His face had lost color. His hands were now hidden beneath the bench. Langston said nothing, because he didn't have to. The room had already heard everything they needed to. For a long moment, no one moved. Langston H. Pierce stood at the center of the courtroom, wrists still bound by the cuffs they had so casually placed on him hours before. And yet, in that moment, he was the only man in the room who wasn't restrained by anything. No shame, no fear, no need to explain. He reached up slowly with calm fingers and unbuttoned the top of his long coat. The fabric rustled soft, deliberate, as he slipped it off his shoulders and folded it over one arm. There was no hurry, no need for drama. From the inside pocket, he pulled out a small black case, leather-bound, worn at the corners. He held it up with quiet precision and opened it. Inside was the seal, gold, heavy, recognized in every courtroom across the nation. Supreme Court of the United States. People leaned forward instinctively, like seeing it made everything real. Langston looked out over the room, not scanning, not searching, just letting the silence settle the way dust does after an explosion. Then finally he spoke. His voice wasn't loud, it didn't need to be. I chose silence, not because I had nothing to say, but because justice isn't just what we say, it's what we allow. Each word landed like a bell toll, steady, clean, impossible to ignore. And today he said, turning slightly toward the judge, the officers, the lawyers, I let you show the world exactly who you are. He didn't raise his voice, didn't point, didn't accuse. He just stood there steady and let the weight of truth fill the room. The prosecutor shifted uncomfortably in her seat. The public defender looked down at her hands. The judge, Judge Grayson, sat back, breath shallow, eyes fixed on the floor. And then with no fanfare, no guards to escort him, no words of permission, Langston turned and walked. The bailiff instinctively moved to stop him, then froze halfway. No one said a word. No one dared. He passed by the gallery, the same rows that once held whispers and smirks. Now they held silence and shame. One of the officers who had arrested him earlier stood near the door. His eyes flicked toward Langston, but then dropped just as quickly. He took a step back, gave way. Others followed. Some moved aside. Some just stared at their shoes. Not because they were told to, but because they couldn't bear to meet the eyes of the man they had dragged in chains. Langston never looked back, never raised a hand, never asked for anything. He walked through the doors like he belonged to something larger than the building itself. Like the law wasn't a title, but something he wore in how he carried himself. And in that quiet wake, he left behind no speeches, no verdicts, no vengeance. Only one thing remained: dignity. Pure, unshakable. Not bought, not borrowed, not declared by force, just present. And for the first time that day, the courtroom didn't feel like a place of punishment. It felt like a place that had just been reminded of what justice actually looks like. It didn't take long. By the time Langston Pierce stepped beyond the courthouse doors, the story had already escaped those walls. One video, grainy, shaken but undeniable, had made its way online. The image of a black man in cuffs, the quiet courtroom, the moment 3 agents had walked in and turned history on its head. People didn't scroll past it. They watched. They paused. And then they shared it. By late afternoon, his name was on every screen. Justice Langston H. Pierce, detained, silenced, dignified. Headlines flooded in, not cautiously, but with an edge sharpened by national shame. Supreme Court Justice detained without ID. Is being black a crime now? Silenced in court until the nation stood up. Cable news hosts struggled to keep their tones steady. Some didn't try. You could hear it, the shake in their voices as they read out the charges that had been filed just hours before. Disturbing the peace. Contempt of court. Contempt. The word itself began to echo, not in defense of the system, but in indictment of it. Crowds started to gather, not chanting, not shouting, but standing in stillness. Hundreds at first, then thousands. Many held signs that bore no slogans, only a name. Langston Pierce. Across social media, hashtags began to surge. But they weren't angry. They were sobering, measured, almost mournful. He said nothing. Justice does not need our dignity, walked out. At the White House, a press conference was called, but it wasn't the press secretary who appeared, it was the president himself. He stood at the podium, his face drawn not with politics, but something closer to personal reckoning. Langston Pierce, he said, is not just a jurist. He is a symbol of what this country aspires to be. Today we failed him, we failed justice, and we failed ourselves. He didn't shout, he didn't spin. I have spoken to Justice Pierce personally. I offered not just an apology, but a promise. There will be a full investigation. No delay, no interference. And this time people believed it, because the system had finally been caught in the light. Judge Grayson was suspended within 24 hours. The arresting officers removed from duty. Internal Affairs opened an inquiry so wide it swept through every hallway of that courthouse. But perhaps the voice that moved people most came from someone no one had known before. A young woman, early 20s, soft-spoken. Camille Tran, Jr., court clerk. She sat across from a news anchor, her hands folded tightly, her voice a notch above a whisper. I saw him that morning, she said, and I knew who he was. I just didn't know if I was allowed to say it out loud. She paused, eyes watering not from guilt, but from something deeper, recognition. Everyone around him acted like he didn't matter. But he looked like someone who remembered exactly who he was. I kept thinking, if I stay quiet, then I'm part of it too. The clip went viral, not because it was dramatic, but because it was honest. It was followed by another image just hours later, a photo of Langston mid-step leaving the courthouse. No entourage, no statement, only a folded coat over his arm and a stillness in his eyes that felt more powerful than any gavel ever dropped. The caption read, "He never raised his voice." But somehow the whole country heard him. After the cameras left, after the headlines began to cool, and after the courthouse slowly returned to its usual rhythm of creaking doors and stamped papers, someone noticed. It was the janitor, actually. Quiet man, worked nights, always careful, always the last to leave. He was wiping down the witness stand when he saw it, a single sheet of paper folded neatly and left behind on the wooden rail. There was no envelope, no name, just ink, and a hand that had taken its time. He didn't open it at first. He looked around, waited. Then with the reverence of someone touching something sacred, he unfolded it. 3 short lines written in calm, deliberate strokes. To all who watch me fall silent, thank you for showing me who you are and for reminding me why justice must never sleep. There was no signature. It didn't need one. Word of the letter spread fast, but it wasn't published in full. Some things people seemed to agree weren't meant for clicks. Instead, they whispered it, passed it along like a truth too fragile to shout. And it stayed not on bulletin boards, but in the quiet corners of memory where moments that matter tend to settle. Outside the courthouse, life moved on. Cases resumed, files reopened. People pretended things had gone back to normal. But for those who had been there that day, really nothing quite looked the same, especially not for the young ones. That afternoon, just as the sun was beginning to lower behind the courthouse steps, a school bus stopped a block away. Kids spilled out backpacks, swinging sneakers, tapping pavement. Among them was a boy, maybe 11, buttoned-up shirt, tie a little crooked, and eyes that held more questions than most adults could handle. He stood by the gate holding the strap of his bag, watching the building like it had just told him a story only he could hear. And then he saw him. Langston, no press, no escort, just the man coat over one arm walking alone toward the street. Their eyes met. And the boy, without thinking, without words, raised his hand. Not a wave, not a salute, just a gesture. A simple, small acknowledgement from one quiet soul to another. Langston slowed, and for the briefest moment he stopped. He looked at the boy, really looked, and in his eyes there was no anger, no burden, only that same stillness, the kind that doesn't break under pressure, it becomes deeper. He gave a small nod, a smile that barely moved his lips, but said everything. And then he walked on, not into history, not into legend, just forward. Sometimes justice doesn't shout, it just waits, watches. And when it finally speaks, the world listens. If this story moved you, tap, like, share it, and subscribe to Mr. Max Stories, where every quiet soul finally finds a voice. Your support fuels our mission to tell the stories that matter, the ones that echo long after they end. Ava didn't speak. She didn't resist. But that didn't stop a white cop from forcing her out of the courtroom in front of everyone. Why does silence make a black woman look dangerous if that first moment made your chest tighten? Don't just scroll by. Tap. Like, share this with someone who still believes in quiet strength, and come with me back into the courtroom, where silence speaks louder than rage. That morning, the courtroom was colder than usual. Not in temperature, but in the way silence seemed to hang like a fog over every bench and every breath. It was the kind of silence that didn't ask for quiet, it demanded it. People sat straighter. Black men folded their hands. Mothers whispered prayers into their sleeves. And every eye found a way not to look directly at the officer sitting at the defendant's table. His name was Officer Deeks. White, mid-30s, stocky build. He wore the uniform like it was armor, not fabric. Across from him sat a boy's family, Malik Watson's parents, shoulders touching as if they needed to hold each other up. Their son wasn't in the room. He couldn't be. He was still recovering. 17 years old and still not speaking full sentences after what happened the night Deeks stopped him outside a liquor store. The charge was excessive force. The evidence, according to his attorney, was a medical report and bruises that hadn't faded even after 4 weeks. But in this courtroom, even bruises needed permission to matter. Ava Langston sat in the back row, third seat from the left. She had arrived early. She hadn't spoken to anyone. No signs, no cameras, just a leather-bound notebook she opened with care and a pen that clicked once, then stayed silent. She wasn't there to be seen, but somehow she always would be. From the moment she entered, Officer Rick Maddox had kept his eyes on her. He stood at the side wall like a statue that knew how to move when needed. His job officially was courtroom security. Unofficially, it was to make sure nothing got out of hand. That meant watching anyone who looked like they might raise their voice or, God forbid, raise a question. And Ava, with her quiet posture and steady pen, had already made him uneasy. Maybe it was the way she didn't glance around nervously like others. Maybe it was how she didn't flinch when the judge raised his voice at Malik's lawyer. Maybe it was simply because she looked too calm, too sure of herself. In places like this, black women weren't supposed to sit still unless they were being judged. They weren't supposed to look composed or observant or aware. And Ava Langston was all of that. Judge Parks presided with a cold efficiency. She moved quickly through the statements, allowing only what she called fact-based testimony and shutting down anything that hinted at emotion. When Malik's mother began to cry, as her husband read his statement, the judge ordered a recess. No one missed the subtext. Feeling was unwelcome here. During that pause, Maddox shifted his stance. Then he moved. He approached Ava slowly. She looked up just once but said nothing. She didn't smile, didn't nod, just waited. And Maddox, instead of walking past her like he had every other observer in that row, stopped. He didn't ask her who she was. He didn't ask what she was doing. He just looked down at her notebook, then at her, and said low enough for only her to hear, "People like you always act like you've got something to prove." Ava closed the notebook. Not fast, not slow, deliberately. The room was filling back up, people returning from the hall, the judge not yet in her seat. But the room was already watching. It wasn't loud. No shouting. No confrontation. Just a pause, a moment of friction between what was expected and what refused to shrink. And maybe Maddox felt it. Maybe he realized too late that some people don't need to make noise to command attention. Ava remained seated. Maddox walked away. But something had already changed. Not because she had spoken. She hadn't. Not because she had resisted. She hadn't. But because in a courtroom full of people waiting to be told what to do, one woman had the audacity to remain exactly who she was. And that was enough to make her dangerous. The recess was short, but something had shifted in the air. People moved quietly, careful not to make eye contact. A few murmured about the judge's sharp tone. Most simply stepped into the hallway as if the walls had grown tighter the longer they sat. Officer Rick Maddox stayed behind. He didn't sit. He leaned against the back wall like a man who believed his presence was enough to keep things in place. But he wasn't watching the lawyers or the judge's bench or the empty juror seats. His eyes were fixed on the back row, on her. Ava Langston hadn't moved. She remained in the exact same seat, her notebook now closed, her hands resting gently on the cover. She wasn't writing anymore, but she hadn't left either. She was still. Still in a way that irritated Maddox more than any shouting ever could. He stepped forward slow and heavy, like a man walking into something he didn't understand but had already decided to control. A few people returning from the hallway saw him move. They didn't stop him. They didn't speak. One woman turned her head quickly away, pretending to check her phone. Maddox stopped beside Ava and bent slightly, his voice low, sharp with disdain. Scribbling something angry, he muttered, planning to disrupt court. Ava didn't answer. She looked up calmly, steadily, with a gaze that didn't challenge but refused to yield. She didn't smile. She didn't shift in her seat. Her silence wasn't defensive, it was composed, unsettling in its quiet certainty. That was what undid him. Not resistance, not confrontation, but the unspoken message that she didn't fear him, didn't see him as a force worth reacting to. And in Maddox's world, that kind of calm was insubordination. Without waiting for permission, without a word to the judge or clerk, Maddox reached for her forearm and pulled her upright. The room hadn't fully settled, but the tension snapped like a rope under strain. Papers rustled, a throat cleared. Someone inhaled sharply, but no one spoke. But no, Ava stood because he gave her no choice. But she rose without stumble, without rush, like a woman who had decided long ago how to carry herself in moments like this. He led her past the benches, past the front rows where lawyers gathered papers and whispered strategy. She didn't glance around for help. She didn't meet eyes, but her presence left a trail behind them, and everyone in that courtroom felt it. When they reached the double doors, Maddox pushed them open with one hand, ready to usher her out like he was taking out trash. Ava paused. She didn't turn fully, didn't raise her voice, just spoke clearly, precisely enough for only him to hear. You'll regret that uniform being the only thing they see. For a moment, Maddox hesitated, not because he understood her words, but because something in her tone made him feel smaller than he wanted to admit. Then the door closed behind them. Inside, the judge returned to the bench. No one mentioned the woman who had been escorted out. No one questioned the reason, and no one moved to speak in her defense. But something in the room had changed. Not in the walls or the process or the paperwork, but in the breath that hung between people. In the way silence no longer felt like, sure, but like the edge of something that might finally begin to crack. What Maddox didn't know, what none of them knew, was that silence had always been Ava Langston's sharpest language. And today it had just been heard by the wrong man. The hallway outside the courtroom was quiet, but not in the same way the courtroom had been. Out here, the silence wasn't heavy. It was thin, functional, a place where protocol replaced presence, where people passed each other with nods, files, clipped greetings, and rarely stopped long enough to see anyone. Ava sat in a small room just off that hallway. It wasn't a holding cell, not exactly, but it was close enough. 4 walls, 1 door, a small bench. No one had asked her any questions. No one had asked her name. She sat with her hands folded loosely in her lap, looking not at the door, but at the floor, as if studying something no one else could see. Her notebook was gone. Maddox had left it somewhere. She hadn't asked for it back. A young officer stood nearby. He wasn't Maddox. He wasn't angry. He just looked confused, maybe a little uneasy. He glanced at her a few times before finally speaking. "Why didn't you say anything?" he asked quietly. Most people would have made a scene. Ava turned her head slightly, met his eyes without any edge. Sometimes, she said, silence draws the loudest attention. He didn't reply. He didn't know how. Outside that room, Maddox was already talking, already laughing. To another officer, maybe 2. She was just sitting there like she was better than the rest of us, he said. Taking notes, acting all quiet. You know the type. The others nodded, half listening, eager not to challenge the man who had just dragged someone out of a courtroom with no resistance. Maddox grinned. Just another angry nobody trying to feel important. He didn't know her name, hadn't asked, hadn't thought to check. To him, she was exactly what he needed her to be, an example. A disruption. A box to tick on a form that would be filed and forgotten. But someone somewhere had to fill out that form, and someone did. And when the clerk entered Langston Ava into the system under a minor disturbance record, a red flag rose. Not for security, not for arrest, but for clearance. Internal affairs clearance. Within minutes, that form reached a second desk, then a third, then the desk of the one man who did know exactly who Ava Langston was. He didn't learn about it from the news. It wasn't on video. No cameras had captured it. But the system itself had whispered her name back to him. Darius Langston. He read the incident code twice, then read the name again. He didn't stand up. He didn't shout. He simply picked up the phone, dialed one extension, and asked, "Where is she now?" The woman on the other end hesitated. "She's being held for review, sir. Minor disruption." Darius closed his eyes for a moment. "Did anyone ask her who she was?" "No, sir." There was a pause. Then he said, "I'll be there in 15 minutes. And he hung up. Back in the hallway, Maddox was still talking, still unaware, still proud of how quickly he'd handled the woman who'd sat too still, looked too calm, and said nothing at all. He didn't realize yet that he hadn't silenced anyone. He'd only raised a name the system had been trained not to forget. Somewhere inside a quiet administrative wing not far from the courtroom but far enough to feel like a different world, a clerk moved through routine without thinking. The names came fast, most passed without notice. But this one didn't. She paused as the letters appeared on her screen. Langston Ava. It wasn't just the name, it was the clearance tag that lit up beside it. A federal marker. Internal affairs. A layer of the system rarely seen at this level but never ignored. A small prompt blinked across her screen. One word: escalate. She clicked. Upstairs, the report landed on a desk that was rarely interrupted. The man who sat behind it didn't flinch when the alert came in. He just stared at the screen a second longer than usual, eyes resting on a name he hadn't expected to see under a disturbance report. Darius Langston didn't move, didn't frown. He simply reached for the phone and dialed a number he knew by heart. The woman who answered sounded crisp, focused. Intake. There's a removal report from the downtown courthouse. A name was flagged. Ava Langston. Where is she? There was a pause, then the sound of typing. She's in a side room, no charge, waiting for clearance. Darius's voice didn't change. Did anyone ask her who she was? No, sir. Another pause, then he said evenly, release her. No further record, no statements, no follow-up entries. Quietly. Yes, we're here. He waited a breath. And don't mention this call. Then he hung up. He sat there for a moment, his hands resting lightly on the desk. Nothing outside his window had changed. The city still moved. But inside this office and soon inside that courthouse, things were already beginning to shift. Because Darius Langston wasn't just a title. He wasn't just a man in a high-back chair. He was a part of the system that watched the watchers. And today, the system had recognized one of its own. Back in the hallway, Maddox walked with the confidence of someone who believed the story was over. He spoke casually to a colleague near the vending machines, half shrugging as he explained how quickly he'd handled a woman who wanted attention without making noise. His voice lowered to a chuckle. Thought she was too smart to cause a scene. Turns out she didn't have to. I made sure of that. The other officer nodded but didn't laugh. A few doors down, the holding room opened quietly. A younger officer entered slower than usual. He looked at Ava without force, without pretense. You're free to go, he said. Ava didn't react with surprise. She stood, adjusted the sleeve of her blouse, and gave the faintest nod. As she walked past him, the officer stepped aside quickly. He looked like he might say something, but instead he simply held the door open a little wider. Ava stepped back into the hallway like she had never left it. She didn't ask questions, she didn't look back. But now the system knew she had been there, and it remembered her name. Not as a note-taker, not as a woman in the back row, but as a credentialed federal investigator. A Langston. And across offices, inboxes, and closed-door conversations, the recognition had begun to ripple. Quietly, firmly, without asking for attention. Because when the wrong name ends up in the wrong report, someone always finds it. And when that name belongs to a woman they pulled from a courtroom for doing nothing at all, the mistake doesn't go unnoticed. It becomes a message. And that message had just reached the one person no one wanted to explain it to. Darius Langston arrived without a sound. He didn't come with a team, didn't wear a badge. No announcement, no escort, no flash of rank. Just a dark suit, a measured step, and a presence that made people straighten without knowing why. He entered the courthouse through a side hallway, nodding briefly to the clerk at the security desk. She didn't recognize him, but she moved slightly to the side, unsure why. He didn't ask for directions. He didn't need to. He knew exactly where to go. The courtroom was back in session. Darius didn't step inside. He stood just past the doors in the shadow of the frame, watching from the corner of a hallway that allowed him to see without being seen. Inside, the hearing had resumed. Officer Deeks sat at the defense table, still postured like a man who believed in the shield more than the truth. Malik Watson's parents sat stiffly 2 rows behind the prosecution, holding hands so tightly their knuckles had turned white. The boy wasn't in the room. He hadn't returned to public spaces since the night he lost consciousness on the pavement outside that liquor store. The lawyer representing the family, a younger black man with a deliberate voice and tired eyes, had just finished reading from a medical report. His client had sustained a neck injury consistent with manual force paired with recorded body cam footage that Deeks had failed to turn on during the initial minutes of contact. Judge Eleanor Parks, seated above it all, remained unmoved. She sipped water without apology, her tone clipped as she responded to motions and objections with the same dry efficiency she was known for. Stick to verified statements, she reminded the prosecution, even as they tried to mention Malik's panic attacks. We're not here for emotional context. Darius watched all of this, watched a courtroom where one side trembled with care while the other stood wrapped in protocol and silence. Watched how the language of pain kept getting trimmed down to bullet points. Watched how a boy's trauma was made to sound like inconvenience. And then he watched Maddox. The officer entered quietly from the side door, looking too casual, too certain. He stepped up to the bench just as the judge signaled a recess. Judge Parks leaned in slightly, just enough to keep her voice out of the microphones. "Who was that woman you removed earlier?" she asked almost offhand. Maddox smirked. "One of those protesters with a pen," he said. "Thought she was someone." Darius didn't move, not when he heard the tone, not when he saw the smirk, not even when the judge didn't challenge the response. He just stood there watching through the glass, still as stone. His jaw didn't clench, his hands didn't curl, he didn't interrupt. But something had landed, something cold and exact. This wasn't the first time Darius had seen the machine in motion. He knew what it looked like when a courtroom protected itself instead of the people it was built for. But this was different. This wasn't just a procedural bias. This was personal. They had taken his sister for nothing, and now they were erasing a boy for everything. He turned, not quickly, but with purpose. He didn't need to speak yet. That part would come. The wheels were already turning. He stepped back into the hallway, pulled his phone from his coat pocket, and tapped in a number that didn't go through channels. The voice on the other end answered without greeting. "It's Langston," he said. "I want a full record of today's hearing. Unedited." There was a pause. Everything. He hung up without another word, and then he kept walking. No announcement, no confrontation, just motion. Because Darius Langston wasn't built for spectacle. He was built for timing. And the room that had dragged his sister out without asking who she was had just shown him everything he needed to know. Ava didn't stand. She didn't clear her throat or ask permission. She didn't raise a hand or even shift in her seat. She simply spoke quietly, clearly from the exact place where they once decided she didn't belong. "That man didn't see a threat," she said. Her voice carried without effort. It moved like a current across the room, pulling attention without demanding it. He saw a mirror, and he hated it. The silence that followed wasn't still. It was tight, wound like a wire between everyone seated and everyone trying not to react too soon. Officer Maddox rose from his chair, red rising beneath his collar. "This is a courtroom, not a place for speeches," he said, voice sharp, cutting the air like a misplaced blade. "She doesn't belong here. She's compromised." Judge Parks didn't flinch. "Officer Maddox, sit down." Maddox hesitated, eyes flicking to the judge, then to Ava, then to the rows behind him as if gauging who still stood on his side. "She was thrown out for a reason," he said, louder now. "This whole thing is—" "I said sit down," the judge repeated, her voice no louder than before but far more final. He sat, not because he wanted to, but because he realized he was alone in his indignation, and it had never felt that cold before. Ava didn't turn to look at him. She looked at no one in particular, just the room. "I wasn't removed because I disrupted order," she continued. "I was removed because I disrupted comfort. Because I sat still in a place where stillness from someone like me feels like a challenge." No one moved. Not Elston. Not Parks. Not even the stenographer who had stopped typing. Ava leaned forward slightly, not in defiance, but in truth. "I was silent when I was dragged out. But that silence was mistaken for weakness. It wasn't. It was calculation, it was composure, and it was record-keeping. There was movement at the back of the courtroom. A tall man in a charcoal gray suit stepped inside. He didn't announce himself. He didn't need to. Darius Langston's presence moved through the room like cold wind across glass. The people who recognized him straightened. The ones who didn't still felt something shift. He walked slowly down the center aisle, stopping behind his sister, hands clasped in front of him. He said nothing, but he was listening. Ava didn't acknowledge him. She didn't need to. She let her pen rest on the folder in her lap. Then she turned to the bench. "I am here not because I want to be seen, but because your process demands it now. This courtroom has asked the public to trust its neutrality while defending the silence of its own bias. I don't speak today as a victim. I speak as a witness to how easily systems confuse discomfort with danger." Elston began to rise from her seat again, but stopped midway. No one told her to sit. She simply didn't have anything left that could hold up under what was now happening. Ava turned just slightly, and for the first time her eyes met Maddox's. There have been 5 complaints filed against him in the last 8 years, she said. All dismissed, all handled internally, and all sealed. Maddox opened his mouth, but no words came. Ava looked back to the judge. I'm not here to prosecute him. That's someone else's job. I'm here to make sure the silence that dragged me out doesn't cover this up too. Then Darius spoke for the first and only time. Your Honor, he said, voice even tone measured. Internal Affairs has formally opened a parallel review into Officer Maddox's conduct during this trial and previous complaints. Documentation is being delivered as we speak. The room didn't erupt. It constricted, like it had finally understood that the quiet woman in the back wasn't the interruption. She was the measure. Judge Parks closed her file and didn't meet Ava's eyes. Her voice, when it returned, had lost some of its polish. Let the record reflect the statements made, she said softly, and allow Internal Affairs full access to courtroom documentation, including all transcripts, video, and notes. There was nothing left to say after that. Ava didn't smile. She didn't shift. She didn't celebrate. She simply picked up her pen and began writing again, because sometimes the loudest thing in the room is the one who's already heard enough. The folder Ava laid on the table was black, unmarked, but thick. She opened it slowly, not for dramatic effect, but with the precision of someone who knew that the weight of what was inside didn't need help announcing itself. This, she said, lifting the top page without looking at anyone, is a report compiled over the last 7 years. It includes 5 formal complaints against Officer Rick Maddox, ranging from intimidation to the obstruction of internal investigations. All 5 were dismissed without external review. All 5 were processed through Sergeant David Barnes' supervision. She didn't look up yet. Her voice remained even low, but it filled the room like light slipping through a crack in a wall no one wanted to admit was there. And in each instance, she continued. The justification for closure reads the same. Insufficient evidence, lack of external corroboration, internal discretion applied. That phrase, internal discretion, was signed off by the same person every time. Now she looked up. Her eyes locked on Barnes, who sat near the side bench, arms folded tightly, jaw flexing. Sergeant Barnes, Ava said, tone no longer just formal. It was final. You've exercised internal discretion 5 times in defense of one officer. That's not discretion. That's pattern. And that pattern has a name now. It's visible, and it's standing in this room. Barnes stood, voice rough as gravel. She's trying to tear down the department, he snapped. You let people like her dig into every decision we've made, you won't have a department left to defend. There were murmurs in the gallery, not loud, but present. No one had ever seen a senior officer speak like that in court, and no one had ever seen someone respond to him without flinching. Ava didn't flinch. She took one quiet breath, then looked straight at him. No, she said, clear and sharp. I'm trying to rebuild what you broke. She didn't have to raise her voice. That sentence landed like it had waited years to be said. Darius didn't speak. He didn't need to. He stood behind her, silent and still a living shadow that gave weight to everything she said. Judge Parks glanced toward the bailiff, but didn't move. Her eyes returned to Ava. Ava reached for the next document, this one slimmer, but just as damning. Officer Deeks' body cam footage was not activated during the first 4 minutes of contact with Malik Watson. That gap matches the exact window when the reported excessive force took place. The footage that begins after shows Malik already disoriented on the ground. There is no explanation in the report for the missing time and no disciplinary measure filed for the lapse. She placed the paper gently in front of the judge. Then she spoke, not as an officer or a woman once dragged from her seat, but as someone who understood the system better than anyone in that room wanted her to. What you see as disruption, she said, is the surface breaking because the structure beneath it is hollow. I'm not here to embarrass your process. I'm here because too many people think silence means nothing's wrong. And that has never been true. The courtroom wasn't still. It was leaning forward. Barnes didn't speak again. His arms dropped slowly, his eyes darting to the side, no longer holding Ava's gaze. Maddox had sunk slightly into his chair, no longer glaring, no longer defiant, just quiet. Ava returned to her seat, the file left open on the table. She didn't need to repeat herself. The words had already settled heavy and inescapable. The turning point hadn't come with shouting or slamming or outrage. It had come with a sentence, simple, irrefutable. I'm trying to rebuild what you broke. And for the first time, no one in the room could say she was wrong. Ava stood again. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't adjust her blouse or clear her throat. She simply reached for the folder in front of her and opened it with the calm of someone who had waited a long time to be heard and no longer needed permission. These are 5 formal complaints, she said, holding up the first document, all filed against Officer Rick Maddox. Intimidation, excessive force, procedural misconduct, violence in separate incidents, 5 separate victims, and 5 times dismissed. The room was quiet, not out of respect, but awareness. Ava laid each document one by one on the judge's bench. Each of these dismissals was signed off under the same phrase, internal discretion applied. And in each case, that discretion came from Sergeant David Barnes. She looked up, now her eyes focused steady. This isn't discretion, it's protection without accountability. And it's been happening behind closed doors for years. Judge Parks didn't respond. She didn't nod, didn't object. Her fingers touched the edges of the papers, but she didn't move them, as though something too fragile or too guilty rested between the lines. Ava turned to face the room. Silence is not a defense, it is a strategy. And silence protected this man until it reached the wrong room. Barnes rose then, his jaw tight. His voice came low and sharp. She's trying to tear this department apart. Ava didn't flinch. No, she said. I'm trying to rebuild what you broke. That line sat in the room like a locked door suddenly kicked open. Maddox shifted in his chair, then stood restless, trying to reclaim the floor. You don't get to walk in here and rewrite the whole damn system. He was cut off not by Ava, not by the judge, but by the sound of a second voice, calm and cutting, from the rear of the courtroom. That's exactly what's happening. All eyes turned. Darius Langston stepped forward, slow and quiet, like a man who had waited for the noise to die down before speaking. He didn't wear a badge. He didn't need to. He walked past the rows of benches, stopped between the prosecution and the defense, and looked directly at the bench. Your Honor, as Director of Internal Affairs, I am formally suspending both Officer Maddox and Sergeant Barnes, effective immediately, pending full federal review. Gasps were audible. Someone whispered from the gallery. Barnes turned red. Maddox started forward. This is outrageous. But the bailiff stepped in this time without prompting. And that was the first moment Maddox realized no one was on his side anymore. One of the junior officers, who had been sitting 3 rows back, slowly stood and took a step away, not in protest, but as if quietly separating himself from what could no longer be justified. Judge Parks still hadn't said a word, but her silence now carried something different. Not authority, not avoidance, but reckoning. Darius turned to Maddox and Barnes. His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. You don't rebuild trust by letting rot sit in the walls. You remove it. Thoroughly. There was no applause, no sound at all, just stillness. Ava lowered herself back into her seat without looking at anyone. She didn't nod at her brother. He didn't look for approval. Their work wasn't done for each other. It was done because someone had to do it. Judge Parks finally looked up. Her voice came low, brittle at the edges. Let the record reflect the suspension as issued by Internal Affairs. This hearing is adjourned until further notice. The gavel didn't slam. It touched the block softly, like something ceremonial, not punitive. But the message had landed. A woman who had been dragged from her seat for sitting too still had returned with documentation, testimony, and a system behind her, not because she yelled, not because she threatened, because she knew what silence meant and how to break it with truth. 1 week later, the room was different. Not larger, not brighter, but changed. The same old walls, the same dull ceiling lights, but the air no longer pressed down the way it once did. It held something lighter now, something honest. A press conference had been called official, quiet, deliberate. No stage, just a long table, a seal behind them, and 2 chairs. Darius Langston sat on the left. Ava Langston sat on the right. Before them stood a podium surrounded by journalists. But this time, microphones weren't raised to catch scandal. They were lowered respectfully to record something real. Darius spoke first. His voice wasn't rehearsed. It didn't need to be. It was clear. The Department of Internal Affairs is opening a formal review of all closed use of force complaints from the past 7 years, he said. Cases dismissed under internal discretion will be re-examined by independent panels with community oversight present during every phase. He paused. We are also restructuring the internal review process. No more sealed dismissals. No more single signature closures. We will no longer confuse silence with resolution. He stepped back. Then a journalist, older, careful, raised his hand. Ms. Langston, he asked, you didn't file a complaint. You didn't call the press. But your actions changed the system. If you could say one thing to the people watching, what would it be? Ava leaned forward, quiet, unhurried. They didn't do it to me. They did it in front of me. I just made sure someone was watching. The quote landed like a stone in still water, and by evening it was everywhere. Across networks, Online headlines, radio segments, talk shows. Her words were printed, quoted, repeated. Not as rage, not as viral fuel, but as a mirror. A woman who said nothing until the truth had to be written. A man who didn't shout, but still knew where to aim the lever of change. Clips of Ava's speech were translated, shared by advocacy groups, reposted by people who had once felt invisible in their own courtrooms. Some wrote captions beneath it. This is the kind of power we never see on the news. She didn't raise her voice. She raised the floor. And still Ava never gave more interviews. She didn't need to. Later that week, long after the headlines faded into scrolls and segments, she returned to the courthouse. Not to attend, just to sit. She stepped through the same wooden door, walked down the same aisle, and sat in the same row where she once held a pen and watched the system pretend not to see her. She sat in that same seat, quietly, not to claim it, but to prove it was never theirs to give or take. No one approached her. No one asked her to move. And a few minutes later, Darius entered. He didn't ask why she came. He simply sat beside her. Not to protect, not to oversee, just to be there. A moment passed, then another. Not heavy, not dramatic, just full. Darius looked forward, not at the judge's bench, but toward the center of the room as if staring through memory. And Ava, eyes still steady, said only one thing. They don't know yet, do they? Darius turned slightly. Know what? That stillness isn't silence. He didn't answer. Because she was right. And maybe finally the room was beginning to understand it too. Because sometimes it takes being dragged out to remind the room what stillness really means. And if this story stayed with you, even for just a moment, if it made you pause, reflect, or remember someone who once sat quietly in a room where no one listened, then we ask just one thing. Don't let it stop here. Share this story with someone who still believes silence means nothing. Like this video if you felt even a flicker of truth in Ava's stillness. And subscribe to Mr. Max Stories if you want more stories like this, stories that speak for the unheard, that hold space for dignity, justice, and quiet courage. Because these stories aren't just fiction. They're reminders. Reminders that power doesn't always shout, and sometimes the ones we try to silence are the very voices we need to hear most. Your support helps our small creative team keep doing what we love, crafting stories that matter, that linger and that speak for something bigger than ourselves. Thanks for watching. We'll see you in the next one where the room is still listening.